Joining me now with his insight and opinion is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and he's also the host of the podcast Reform This, as well as a former Navy officer. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Jasser.
It's good to be with you.
Should the U.S. designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization?
Absolutely. I testified to this, Michelle, back in July 2018 to the House Oversight Committee chaired by Congressman DeSantis at the time. And my testimony was there is nothing more pro-Muslim than designating them as a terrorist organization. We have been playing defense against radical Islamists for decades, and certainly since 9/11. And the offense would be to declare the mothership of Al-Qaeda, the mothership of ISIS, the mothership of Islamic Jihad, which is the conveyor belt that comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, Hamas, it is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So to say that the Egyptian Muslim Brothers, which have proven over and over again that they have worked closely with Zawahiri. Morsi had a close relationship with Zawahiri. Zindani in Yemen had a became Al-Qaeda when he was also on the board of the Union of the Good of the Muslim Brotherhood. So most of the chapters or the offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood are terror organizations and have been proven to be that. Now, I will add one nuance, which is we have to be careful. Many of the naysayers to designating them as an FTO will say, well, in the West, it would take away their freedoms, etc. Nobody's saying that Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups would then be designated foreign terrorist organizations. That's a whole different, they have different names, they have condemned terrorism. We're talking about Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, the chapters in Kuwait, the chapters in Syria, Hamas, which is already an FTO, and other organizations throughout the world that have been demonstrated to be terror organizations.
Dr. Jasser, as you mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood has ties to several terrorist organizations, Hamas certainly being one of them. As you said, it was the breeding ground for the leaders of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But officially, it does not advocate violence. It officially renounced violence in the 1970s. At least that's what it claims. So what exactly does the Muslim Brotherhood advocate?
Well, if what you're saying is true, when I testified, the Democrats brought a Brookings Institute scholar, who, by the way, Brookings funded by Qatar, in which Qaradawi and other Muslim Brotherhood leaders globally spread their message. So the apologetics about the Brotherhood say that they condemn terror, but their logo still is a cross of swords that says jihad is our way and dying by the way of Allah is our creed and our goal. So they are still a violently based organization that relishes in death, that relishes in war, and has not put that aside. And when they do come to power, as they did in Egypt, they may declare they're for democracy. But just as Erdogan in Turkey said that democracy is like a train, you ride it till you get where you want to go, and then you get off. That's exactly what the Muslim Brotherhood is about. Democracy, elections are a tool. They use nonviolent aspirations in order to deceive others into thinking they're nonviolent. And then in Egypt, when they lost power, they declared terror, they declared war and jihad, started blowing up churches and committing acts of terror in 15 and 16, much after they were no longer part of the democratic process.
Dr. Jasser, you mentioned Qatar, and Qatar, as you quite rightly say, is one of the biggest patrons of the Muslim Brotherhood. You mentioned Turkey as well, and there are offshoots or links to the Muslim Brotherhood in President Erdogan's political party. So what would it mean diplomatically if the U.S. goes ahead with this designation? What does it mean for relations, for example, with NATO ally Turkey?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, when we were in a Cold War against the Soviets, what did it mean when we called the Soviets the evil empire? And then we also had an American Communist Party. We had communist parties in Europe and elsewhere. So many of them were breeding grounds for the ideologies, but yet we didn't shut them down, but it made them more radioactive. And I think that's what needs to happen is, yes, we need to revisit whether Turkey and Erdogan's cult need to be part of NATO. I do not believe they should be part of NATO, and that should be revisited because they don't share our aspirations, they don't share our values, and they have a theocratic mandate which is completely against the mandate of freedom and democracy of NATO. And, I think all of these things will be like a radioactive withering on the vine, which is you treat the mothership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and eventually its offshoots will begin to become marginalized, and you'll start to see reformist Muslims like myself and our reform movement start to get more attention and platforms because the tribal elevation of the Muslim Brotherhood will change and become no longer the de facto leaders of the Muslim community.
Dr. Jasser, why do you think the Muslim Brotherhood has not been designated a terrorist organization by the U.S. already?
Well, that's because they have convinced through their leaders in the mosques, through their leaders in many Islamic organizations in the West, as you see in the documents of the Holy Land Foundation and all of the unindicted co-conspirators that were documented as part of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, that they have convinced so many. Brookings has papers out today that they're pushing through their PR arms that say that it's going to be a criticism of all Islam. It's going to be an attack on every Muslim. So they equate Islamist membership in that party with being Muslim and with Islam. It's the same thing you and I have discussed when they call criticisms of Islamists Islamophobia, when in fact it's not any phobia against the faith, it's actually anti-theocratic. So this is what's happened, is so many on the left and actually some on the right have been duped into believing that every Muslim is offended by designating Islamists terrorists, when in fact Iran on the Shia side, you see most of the Shia community that are rational have no problem declaring the IRGC, declaring the Khomeinists theocrats and terrorists themselves. So why shouldn't we do the same on the Sunni side?
I just want to give our viewers a little bit more background about this organization, Dr. Jasser, founded in Egypt 1928 with tremendous influence and ties to Hitler and the Nazis. Can you give us a little bit more color on how this Muslim Brotherhood came about?
So the Muslim Brotherhood basically evolved from the ideology of Sayyid Qutb, which is the founding philosopher, but then Hassan al-Banna put it on steroids, and then through scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who now is in his late 80s, still has a following of 60 million plus on Al Jazeera that watch his show Sharia and Life. So ultimately, the Muslim Brotherhood is a viral populist movement of an Islamic party, a political party with a platform, as we saw in Egypt when they came to power, that includes trying to get into place not only the Islamic State identity, but the constitution becomes the Quran, and their ideology becomes a theocratic implementation of Islamic law as they see it. So from the time of World War II, they have had alliances with fascists, be it the Nazis, right, be it the Soviets and others, and they have continued that alliance through the red-green axis, as many of us call it, because they see the West as their greatest enemy and Israel as their greatest enemy.
Thank you again, as always, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle.